What if the most deadly natural disaster in an entire region left no fire, no collapsed buildings, no visible destruction at all? On the morning of August 22nd, 1986, rescuers arriving at villages in northwestern Cameroon found people and animals lying exactly where they had been the night before, as if the world had simply paused. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
The question at the center of this episode is how something invisible, odorless, and silent can end thousands of lives within minutes, without a single explosion, without a single warning anyone recognized in time. Tonight, we turn to Lake Nyos in Cameroon and to a category of natural disaster, so rare and so counterintuitive that scientists did not fully understand it until after it had already happened. We ask what happens when nature does not erupt with force, but with the quiet failure of an equilibrium that had been building for decades.
The Lake Nyos disaster is unlike almost any other natural catastrophe in recorded history. There was no earthquake felt at the surface, no eruption visible from outside, no storm, no flood. What happened was a release of gas, a sudden and catastrophic release of carbon dioxide from the depths of a lake that had spent decades storing it in silence.
We are speaking about the limnic eruption of Lake Nyos on August 21st, 1986.
An event in which somewhere between 3,500 people lost their lives, along with thousands of livestock, within a radius of more than 20 kilometers from the lake, not one of them touched by fire or water or physical force.
Then let us begin with that night, with the hours before anyone understood what had happened.
The evening of August 21st was ordinary in the villages around Lake Nyos. Families had eaten, fires were burning, cattle were settled for the night. The lake itself, situated in a high volcanic crater in the northwestern highlands of Cameroon, was calm and appeared blue and clear, as it usually did. At some point during the night, witnesses who survived reported a deep rumbling sound, followed by what some described as a rushing wind. From the lake, a column of water rose to a height estimated at between 80 and 100 meters. The surface of the lake turned a deep rust color almost immediately, a sign that iron-rich water from the depths had been violently displaced upward.
So, there's a visible event at the lake, but most of the victims never saw it.
Exactly. The column of water was dramatic, but what mattered was what came with it. An enormous volume of carbon dioxide, estimated at between 100,000 and 300,000 tons, was released into the atmosphere within minutes. Because carbon dioxide is heavier than air, it did not disperse upward. It settled close to the ground and began to flow downhill. The gas moved through the valleys surrounding the lake at low altitude, displacing the oxygen in the air as it traveled. It reached the nearest villages within minutes. People who were awake experienced sudden dizziness, confusion, and lost consciousness before they could understand what was happening. People who were already asleep never regained consciousness at all.
So the victims did not experience panic. They simply stopped.
In most cases, yes. Survivor accounts described a sensation of warmth, a smell some compared to gunpowder or rotting eggs, and then nothing. Those who survived had typically been on higher ground, upwind of the cloud, or in locations where the local topography deflected the gas away from them. One survivor described waking to find his family lying around him, unable to move, and stepping outside to discover that his cattle, his neighbors, and the birds in the trees had all passed away. Fires in the village had been extinguished, not by water, but by the absence of the oxygen they needed to continue burning.
So even the fires went out. The entire environment had changed, and no one who survived had any framework for understanding.
Yes, and this produced a second layer of the disaster, the confusion and terror that followed. Survivors who returned to the villages described entering a scene that appeared to be the aftermath of something catastrophic, but left no trace of its mechanism. Bodies lay in the same positions as when their occupants had been alive. Food was still on tables. Children were in their beds. The initial explanations proposed by local communities included supernatural causes, poisoned water, and deliberate chemical attack. These were not irrational responses. They were the only frameworks available to people who had never encountered anything resembling what they were witnessing.
And the scientific response was not immediately more certain.
No. Early investigations considered volcanic eruption, a meteorite impact, and chemical weapons. The true mechanism, a massive release of dissolved carbon dioxide from within the lake itself, was not immediately obvious because it had almost no precedent in documented scientific literature. This is the turning point in understanding the disaster. To explain what happened at Lake Nyos, we have to go back much further, to the geology of the region and to the specific and unusual properties of the lake itself.
So the lake was not simply a lake, it was something geologically specific.
Yes, Lake Nyos sits on the Cameroon volcanic line, a chain of volcanic features extending from the Gulf of Guinea northeastward through the African continent. The lake itself occupies a maar, a type of crater formed when rising magma meets groundwater, and produces a steam explosion that blows a wide, shallow hole in the earth. Maar lakes tend to be deep relative to their surface area, and are underlain by volcanic geology. Beneath Lake Nyos, magma continues to release carbon dioxide into the rock. This gas seeps upward through fractures and dissolves into the water at the bottom of the lake, where pressure is high. The deeper the water, the more gas can be held in solution, in the same way that carbonation remains dissolved in a sealed bottle under pressure.
So the lake was, in a sense, a pressurized bottle that had been filling for a very long time.
Exactly, and the reason it could fill for so long without releasing is the specific structure of the lake. Lake Nyos is what scientists call a meromictic lake. In most lakes, seasonal temperature changes cause the surface water to cool, become denser and sink, mixing the water column and releasing any dissolved gases before they can accumulate to dangerous levels. In a meromictic lake, this mixing does not occur. The deep water is permanently denser than the surface water, due to its mineral content and dissolved gases, and the two layers remain separated. The bottom layer effectively never reaches the surface. Gas accumulates at depth, year after year, held in solution by pressure, with no natural mechanism to release it gradually.
So the lake was stable on the surface, while accumulating an enormous and growing tension underneath.
Yes, and the trigger when it finally came was probably not dramatic. The most widely accepted hypothesis is that a small landslide on the crater wall disturbed the stratified water layers, causing a parcel of deep gas-saturated water to rise slightly toward the surface. As that water rose, the pressure on it decreased, and gas began to come out of solution, forming bubbles. The bubbles made the water lighter, causing it to rise faster. As it rose faster, more gas came out of solution. This is a positive feedback loop, and once it begins, it cannot be stopped. The entire column of gas-saturated water from the bottom of the lake effectively erupted upward in a matter of minutes.
So it is like a shaken bottle of carbonated water, but at a scale measured in hundreds of thousands of tons.
That analogy is precise and useful. The moment the cap is loosened, the dissolved gas seeks its equilibrium with the atmosphere, and the process is instantaneous once initiated. At Lake Nyos, that process released enough carbon dioxide to fill a dense cloud that traveled more than 20 kilometers from the lake at ground level, following the valleys and hollows of the landscape. The cloud was not hot. It was not toxic in the chemical sense. It was simply a concentration of a gas that the human body cannot detect by smell or sight, displacing the oxygen needed to sustain consciousness and life. At concentrations above approximately 10%, carbon dioxide causes rapid loss of consciousness. At higher concentrations, it is fatal within minutes.
So people had no warning and no chance to respond.
In most cases, no. The only survivors in the most heavily affected villages were those whose position or elevation happened to place them above the cloud. The gas hugged the ground, so a difference in altitude of a few meters could mean the difference between consciousness and losing one's life. But here is where it shifts in a way that makes the Nyos disaster even more troubling in retrospect. This was not the first time something like this had happened. 2 years earlier, in August of 1984, a smaller but structurally identical event had occurred at nearby Lake Manaun, less than 100 kilometers from Nyos, claiming the lives of 37 people.
So there had been a warning.
Yes, but the Manaun event was not correctly understood at the time. The losses were attributed initially to a road accident and then to volcanic gases in a vague and unspecific sense. The concept of a limnic eruption as a distinct and recognizable natural phenomenon did not yet exist in the scientific literature. There was no framework into which the Manaun event could be placed that would have prompted systematic monitoring of other lakes in the region. When Nyos occurred 2 years later, at a scale roughly 50 times larger, the same mechanisms were at work, but the outcome was incomparably worse. The failure at Manaun was not a failure of will or resources. It was a failure of conceptual understanding. The phenomenon was genuinely unknown, and unknown phenomena cannot generate the warnings needed to prevent them.
So the disaster at Nyos was, in part, the cost of encountering something for which there was no prior name.
Yes, and the international scientific response that followed the Nyos disaster was itself a demonstration of how slowly understanding can move even in the presence of catastrophic evidence. Teams from France, the United States, Japan, and other countries converged on the site in the weeks and months after the event. The process of establishing the true mechanism took time, collaboration, and the willingness to discard earlier hypotheses. The limnic eruption model, once established, allowed scientists to recognize that Lake Nyos was not merely a historical catastrophe, but an ongoing threat. The lake had refilled with carbon dioxide at depth within years of the 1986 event. Without intervention, another eruption was not only possible, but likely, potentially on a similar or larger scale.
So the question became how to prevent a repeat without draining the lake or removing the geological source of the gas.
Yes, and the solution that was eventually developed is one of the more elegant pieces of engineering to emerge from a natural disaster response. A team led by French scientist Michel Halbwachs designed a degassing system using a simple polyethylene pipe lowered to the bottom of the lake. Because the water at the bottom of the lake is saturated with carbon dioxide under high pressure, once the pipe is primed, the gas-rich water rises naturally through the pipe and degasses at the surface in a controlled fountain. The gas disperses safely into the atmosphere in concentrations too low to be dangerous. The system is self-sustaining. The rising gas-laden water powers its own ascent, requiring no external pump or energy source.
So the same force that caused the disaster is used to prevent its recurrence.
Exact. The first pipe was installed at Lake Nyos in 2001, and additional pipes have been added since. Lake Monoun received a similar installation. Monitoring systems now track gas concentrations at depth, and the degassing process continues steadily, slowly, reducing the stored carbon dioxide in both lakes. The response to Lake Nyos also revealed a persistent human dimension to the disaster that did not resolve with the installation of the pipes. The survivors and the communities in the surrounding area had been displaced from their land and villages in the aftermath of the event. Questions about when and whether it was safe to return, and how to weigh the risk of another eruption against the loss of land and livelihood, occupied local and national policy for years.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to understand the full story of Lake Nyos and the science behind what happened, where would you invite them to continue it?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with Lake Nyos, Nature's Silent Fury by Zamed Amir.
So this is a book that brings together the geological science, the human accounts, and the long aftermath.
Yes, Amir examines the geological formation of the lake, the accumulation of carbon dioxide beneath its surface, and the catastrophic limnic eruption of 1986. Through a combination of scientific analysis, historical context, and human accounts, the book provides a detailed understanding of how an invisible natural process led to massive loss of life.
And is this a book that requires scientific background to follow?
It does not. The scientific mechanisms are explained with clarity and without assuming prior knowledge of geology or chemistry. The book balances technical explanation with the human dimension of the story, including the long-term consequences for the affected communities and the engineering solutions developed to prevent future disasters.
So reading it gives you both the science of what happened and the full weight of what it meant for the people involved.
Yes, and it leaves the reader with a clear sense of what it means to encounter a natural phenomenon for which no prior framework existed, which is itself one of the more unsettling aspects of this story.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The legacy of Lake Nyos extends well beyond the hills of northwestern Cameroon, and it centers on a body of water that dwarfs Nyos in every dimension. Lake Kivu, on the border between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda, is one of the African Great Lakes, roughly 2,000 square kilometers in surface area and over 400 meters deep at its greatest extent. Lake Kivu is also meromictic. It also sits above volcanic geology on the East African Rift, and its deep waters contain dissolved carbon dioxide, and additionally, enormous quantities of dissolved methane. Estimates suggest that the lake holds in solution roughly 300 cubic kilometers of carbon dioxide and approximately 60 cubic kilometers of methane.
So Lake Kivu is, by scale, incomparably more dangerous than Lake Nyos was.
Yes, and approximately 2 million people live along its shores. The cities of Goma in Congo and Gisenyi in Rwanda are positioned directly at the lake's edge. A limnic eruption at Lake Kivu would not claim thousands of lives. It would threaten millions. The question of what would trigger such an eruption is not purely hypothetical. The Nyiragongo volcano, one of the most active in the world, sits immediately adjacent to the northern shore of the lake. It has erupted multiple times in recent decades, and lava flows have reached the lake on at least one occasion. A sufficiently large volcanic event or seismic disturbance could potentially destabilize the stratification that currently prevents the deep gas from rising.
So the risk at Lake Kivu is real and ongoing, not theoretical.
Yes, and this is where the story of Lake Nyos connects to a present-day tension that is as much economic and political as it is scientific. The methane dissolved in Lake Kivu is not only a danger, it is also a significant energy resource. Rwanda has developed an industrial-scale methane extraction program, pumping gas from the lake's depths, processing it, and using it to generate electricity for the national grid. The extraction serves a dual purpose. It provides power to a country with significant energy needs, and it gradually reduces the volume of dissolved gas in the lake, lowering the risk of an uncontrolled release. But the process is enormously complex to manage safely, and the scientific understanding of how extraction affects the lake's stratification over the long term is still developing.
So the same substance that represents the danger is also the resource that funds part of the mitigation.
Yes, they are improvised from what exists, shaped by economic pressures and political realities, and evaluated against a future that cannot be known with certainty. The scientific category of limnic eruption, which did not exist before 1986, now exists as a recognized and documented phenomenon. Researchers study it. Engineers design against it. Governments and international organizations include it in risk assessments. The concept was created by the disaster, in a very real sense.
So the disaster at Nyos did not only take lives, it also produced knowledge that did not previously exist.
Yes. And that is one of the more difficult aspects of the legacy to hold together. The cost of that knowledge was enormous, and it was paid entirely by communities in rural Cameroon who had no part in the geological conditions that threatened them, and no means to have anticipated or prepared for what happened. How? The Lake Nyos disaster remains a defining case in the study of geohazards, in the ethics of disaster response, and in the philosophy of scientific knowledge. It is a reminder that nature does not limit its most dangerous expressions to the dramatic and the visible. Some of the most lethal processes are the quietest and most patient, and the least legible to the communities they eventually reach.
So the lesson of Lake Nyos is not only geological, it is epistemological.
Yes. It tells us something about the limits of what we can know in advance of encountering a phenomenon we have not yet named, and it tells us something about the relationship between those limits and the unequal distribution of who bears the cost when those limits are exposed. The lake today appears calm. The degassing pipes continue their work. The rust color that appeared on the night of August 21st has long since faded, but the conditions that produced it are still present, in a lake that is still accumulating gas, in a region that sits above geology that has not changed.
Thank you for staying with us tonight, and thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the silence, the science, and the long shadow of the night that Lake Nyos changed everything.
The most dangerous equilibrium is the one that has been stable long enough to be mistaken for permanence.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.